The outrage over Janelle sitting down with Kody has been predictably theatrical. The familiar chorus insisting she must be a doormat, too nice, too forgiving, and therefore obviously on the verge of crawling back. Because nothing says serious analysis like treating a single conversation as a full-blown relapse. The more plausible explanation is also the less entertaining one. After a devastating loss, the emotional math changes. When the worst thing that can happen does happen, many of the old big issues stop qualifying as emergencies. The soul-crushing kind of grief has a way of reducing petty warfare to background noise, not because the harm disappears, but because perspective arrives like a wrecking ball and clears the room. This is not weakness, it is triage. And despite the melodramatic insistence that a meeting equals surrender, the boundaries could not have been clearer. Robin was explicitly not welcome. That is not the posture of someone angling for reconciliation. That is someone controlling the terms of engagement with a man who has rarely respected anyone else's terms. The meeting reads less like romantic backsliding and more like an exhausted, deliberate choice to focus on what can be carried forward without being consumed by what cannot. Grief does not always produce a clean, vindictive narrative that fits neatly into a viewer's preferred storyline. Sometimes it produces restraint. Sometimes it produces a refusal to spend the remaining oxygen on rage. The demand that Janelle perform anger on command, preferably in an endless loop for the benefit of spectators, misses a basic reality. Grace can be a survival strategy. Extending it does not require believing someone deserves it. It can simply be the most efficient way to protect what remains of one's emotional bandwidth. After the loss of a child, many people describe a radical reordering of priorities. Irritations that once felt enormous become trivial. Hard feelings soften, and the appetite for prolonged conflict evaporates. Not because the past has been redeemed, but because grief is already a full-time occupation. There is often no energy left to keep sharpening knives. Of course, grief does not produce identical outcomes in every person, which makes the certainty of armchair judgment even more impressive. Some people become calmer. Others become furious, reactive, and merciless toward anyone who crosses them. Both responses are common, and neither is particularly shocking when the nervous system is operating under sustained trauma. The expectation that loss should generate one correct personality, either saintly serenity or permanent scorched earth vengeance, is a comforting fantasy for those who prefer grief to be tidy and aesthetically consistent. There is also an uncomfortable element critics prefer to ignore. The bond to the other parent does not vanish simply because the relationship failed. In the aftermath of losing a child, it is not unusual to reach for connection with the person who shared that child, even when the romantic partnership is damaged or irreparable. It can be part of the grieving process, an attempt to touch the only other person who inhabits that specific universe of memories. That pull is not the same as wanting the relationship back, and treating it as such is an oversimplification masquerading as insight. None of this requires pretending Kody earned the courtesy. It requires acknowledging that Janelle's composure may have far more to do with self-preservation than forgiveness. That said, not everyone would or should make the same choice. There is a perfectly valid counterpoint. Breaking bread with someone who neglected a child or treated that child poorly would feel unthinkable, especially when that person has visibly invested affection and attention elsewhere. For some, a meeting would not be catharsis. It would be capitulation. The difference is that this is a personal boundary decision, not a morality play with a single acceptable script. The only truly indefensible position is the smug certainty that grief must look a certain way on cue. People who have watched a child loss up close often describe it as the kind of event that can scramble judgment, provoke weird choices, and temporarily dismantle a person's usual sense of self. That is not a character flaw. That is trauma doing what trauma does. The more responsible response is to grant room for messy humanity rather than demanding performance-ready righteousness. Janelle is not obligated to be anyone's vengeance fantasy. She is allowed to be a grieving mother with boundaries, selective memory, and the audacity to choose peace, even when peace is inconvenient for the spectators who insist rage is the only proof of strength. Kody's latest performance, informing Christine that he wants her to be able to heal, lands exactly where it belongs, in the museum of self-congratulating nonsense. The premise is almost elegant in its arrogance. Christine, seated beside a steady, affectionate husband, visibly thriving, financially independent, professionally successful, and surrounded by friends and family who actually enjoy her company, is apparently still waiting for the spiritual gift of Kody's approval to finish recovering. The implication is not subtle. Healing is framed as something he dispenses, like a benevolent monarch granting mercy to a former subject. Naturally. This is the same man who treated an apology to Janelle as an accolade, her high honor, as though receiving his remorse is a ceremonial privilege. The inflated self-importance would be impressive if it were not so relentlessly predictable. The worldview is simple. He remains the axis of everyone else's emotional universe, and any woman who leaves must be sitting somewhere, devastated, replaying his greatest hits. The reality, unfortunate for the mythology, is that leaving is rarely the first step. It is the visible part of a long, quiet plan, months or years of thinking, preparing, disentangling, and healing well before the exit becomes public. By the time Christine walked away, the work had already been underway. His scripted little address arrived late to a story that had already moved on without him. And Christine's response, calm, steady, and strategically uncooperative, was the most effective critique possible. She watched him stumble through his lines without rescuing him, without providing the emotional cues he expected, without playing the role he assigned. No interruption, no pleading, no gratifying outrage, just silence and composure. It was a small moment with a large effect. The power he assumed he still had simply failed to appear. When someone's influence depends on being treated as central, being treated as irrelevant is devastating. The insistence that an apology is necessary for healing is not merely misguided, it is manipulative. An apology from an abuser is not the key that unlocks recovery. Healing happens through distance, clarity, self-worth restored, and learning to love and be loved outside the orbit of the person who caused the damage. Christine's stability, confidence, and visible joy have made that point more convincingly than any speech ever could. The very notion that she requires his permission to be well is less an offer than an attempt to reassert authority. That attempt becomes easier to understand when viewed through the lens of narcissism. The rewriting of events to preserve the narrator's innocence and importance. When reality includes a woman leaving on her own terms, building a happier life, and proving that the center of the universe was optional, the ego has to improvise. So the story is revised. Permission is retroactively granted. Healing is reframed as something he allowed rather than something she achieved. It is history edited for control, not accuracy. Meanwhile, the supporting cast provided its own commentary. Janelle's receptive reaction to the honor routine was a letdown. an unnecessary endorsement of the premise that Kody's contrition is a trophy. The disappointment is sharp precisely because higher standards were expected. The fall in credibility is real. Others, previously lower in the rankings, suddenly look more perceptive by comparison. Christine, on the other hand, remains both petty and correct, the rare combination that makes for excellent television and even better vindication. She left first, secured her home, kept the children close, and built a life that does not require managing Kody's ego as a daily chore. If the goal was to demonstrate who is actually thriving, the scoreboard is not ambiguous. The most effective way to handle a personality that feeds on reaction is not to debate, bargain, or beg for fairness. It is to offer nothing. No emotional fuel, no argument to dominate, no role to play. Call it detachment, call it restraint, call it refusing to audition for someone else's narrative. The result is the same. Christine did not need Kody's apology to heal. She needed Kody out of the way. And that part, at least, has been handled flawlessly. Kody's apology tour arrives with all the sincerity of a press conference held to take responsibility while carefully avoiding anything resembling responsibility. Even in the partial footage, the intent is unmistakable. This is not an attempt to repair harm. It is an attempt to reassert control, reclaim the spotlight, and polish an image that no longer survives contact with reality. It opens with the classic non-apology preamble. He is not the only one responsible for the hurt and mess, an elegant way to announce that blame will be redistributed before the first sentence even finishes. Then comes the supposedly noble mission. He is here to make it right, for himself. A rare moment of honesty, accidentally delivered. This is framed as reconciliation, but it functions as self-service. The primary goal is not Christine's closure. It is his comfort. The staging does the rest of the talking. The request to put the beers down so he can speak is not a gesture of respect. It is a demand for attention. Everyone's hands, everyone's eyes, everyone's focus, back where he prefers it. Control masquerading as gravity. The olive branch is then presented as something Christine should accept so she can heal, as if her emotional timeline is his to evaluate and manage. The arrogance here is almost impressive. The confidence required to position himself as the authority on where she is in her healing process, while simultaneously demonstrating why healing was necessary in the first place. Then there is David's presence, which is treated less like a normal reality of Christine's life and more like a strategic audience member. David is invited not to witness accountability, but to be managed. The concern is not, how can amends be made, but how can this look? The rationale is transparent. David must not think poorly of him. Reports that David has been speaking about him only sharpen the point. This is reputation maintenance, not remorse. The apology becomes a performance aimed at the one observer whose opinion currently feels threatening. Naturally, the performance cannot tolerate interruption, even from the person supposedly receiving the apology. When Christine attempts to respond, he talks over her and interrupts repeatedly. The message is clear. Her role is to listen, absorb, and validate. Participation is welcome only when it supports the narrative. This is not dialogue. It is a monologue with witnesses. It is a textbook narcissistic maneuver. Lose control, then try to regain it by recentering everything on the self, including the consequences of one's own behavior. Even more revealing is how differently he approaches Janelle versus Christine, as though each woman exists in a separate universe where the others cannot see what is happening. The contrast mirrors long-standing patterns in how they were treated and, unsurprisingly, why they left. The same personality traits that eroded those relationships are not being corrected. They are being redeployed with fresh packaging. This tour is not self-reflection. It is brand management. The looming stop with Mary inspires dread for a reason. The expectation is not that he will finally offer her the decency he withheld, but that he will attempt something worse, extracting an apology from her. Apparently, the menu of mistreatment was already extensive, yet pettiness always finds room for an encore. The tone suggests a small man engaged in small maneuvers, less interested in amends than in winning a scoreboard that only he insists exists. The underlying motives are not subtle. This apology tour appears designed to serve two purposes: provide content for the show and rehabilitate his image for the audience. And, again, for David. Genuine humility would require conceding wrongdoing without attaching conditions, caveats, or shared blame. That would be incompatible with a worldview in which he never does anything wrong. When confronted with the plain truth of his behavior, the reflex is predictable. Turn it back on the wives. This happened because she did that. Cause and effect rewritten as a defense strategy. The most absurd element is the insistence that Christine should show grace, as if forgiveness is owed simply because a speech was delivered. Christine's refusal to play along, cutting through the theatrics with a blunt, "It's in the past," lands like the only adult sentence in the room. Yet, he keeps insisting he wants to apologize for his part, clinging to the fiction that the damage was evenly distributed. The reality presented is far more straightforward. The cruelty was concentrated, deliberate, and ongoing. There was no failure to uphold vows on Christine's side. The willingness to love, to be loved, and to sustain intimacy existed. What did not exist was a partner willing to meet her there. Instead, the relationship was reduced to declarations that intimacy was unwanted and attraction absent, delivered with the apparent expectation that a wife would simply remain in place, indefinitely, as a rejected accessory. It is difficult to imagine a more effective strategy for ending a marriage while insisting it is someone else's fault. And as always, when problems arise, the blame does not go to the one person with the most power in the family structure. It goes to whichever wife is most convenient to sacrifice that week. If Christine has problems, the suspicion is they will be pinned on Mary. When the conversation turns to Mary, his problems will suddenly originate from her. This pattern has been embedded since the beginning. If the kids struggle, it is a wife's fault. If access to the kids is limited, it is a wife's fault. If jealousy exists, it is the women's fault. The group is trained to fall in line and blame whoever currently occupies the bottom rung, while the person orchestrating the hierarchy presents himself as the victim of everyone else's shortcomings. So the apology tour is not a journey toward accountability. It is a rerun of the same dynamic: control, image management, interruption, blame shifting, and a carefully curated version of contrition that demands grace while refusing responsibility. The only thing that has changed is the audience. Robin Brown's latest revelation arrives with the kind of spiritual urgency that allows a woman to wake early at 11 a.m., then wander through her self-styled Versailles as though lethargy were a sacrament. The scene opens on Aurora, stationed in the lounge with her boyfriend, except the boyfriend is, apparently, a mechanical bucking bull named Brody, because nothing says mature courtship like outsourcing intimacy to coin-operated livestock. Aurora's explanation is beautifully on brand. After childhood holidays at Kody's father's ranch in Wyoming, the cowboy phase is simply being skipped in favor of the ultimate prize, as if commitment is a carnival ride and the family's emotional life is measured in quarters. The inspiration, inevitably, is Kody's emotional range, a phrase doing heroic work to dignify what is, in practice, a man who can pivot from self-pity to grandiosity without ever stopping at accountability. Kody is found in the garage, performing 1,000 pull-ups, radiating the particular confidence of someone who believes hygiene is ideological. Deodorant, he insists, is a manosphere conspiracy designed to make men smell feminine rather than opulent, which is a poetic way of announcing that everyone nearby will be suffering for his principles. He asks for the PDA that the household supposedly forbids, and Robin obliges with a brisk survivalist peck, an efficient woodpecker of affection that leaves him disappointed, because nothing satisfies a man who has confused sacredness with entitlement. He frames their relationship as holy, while lobbying for practical benefits. Identify the love language, lock the bedroom door, and stop the 20-year-olds from barging in at night. An oddly domestic request from someone determined to live as the high priest of chaos. Kody tries to romanticize a past moment in St. George, remembered vividly between chimichangas and hot chocolate behind a gas station, confidently diagnosing physical touch as the axis of their bond. Robin cuts through this with the precision of a receipt. The love language is David Yurman. Not patience, not partnership, not mutual respect. Jewelry. Even the theology is accessorized. The narrative then performs its favorite contortion. Robin claims to have felt called to plural marriage since birth, which supposedly explains years with the evil and morally bankrupt Mr. Jessup, despite the inconvenient detail that no sister wives were ever sought during that time. Kody counters with an equally polished myth, a military veteran identity, complete with an interrogation scene where a British woman dared to ask a question and was shut down for the crime of not being Robin, an anecdote that functions less as biography and more as a warning label about his relationship to scrutiny. The flourish continues with an image of him boarding a flight home from Morocco first, alongside other military veterans, because nothing says disciplined service like cutting the line in the name of valor. Then comes the most honest admission in the entire performance. The apology tour with the ex-wives was done for Robin's benefit, a traveling production designed so she could watch him insult Christine, calling her an alcoholic and daring her to chug her beer, before delivering a half-hearted, surface-level apology that lands with the grace of community theater melodrama. And yes, that's the point. The theatrics are presented as romantic currency, the kind that turns Robin on. Because in this universe, sincerity is optional, but spectacle must be relentless. A new date is proposed, not out of affection but necessity. Kody needs to be removed from the new house, as though he's less a spouse than an overstimulated prop. Dining options in Flagstaff are described as mysteriously depleted after the family's visits, an exaggeration that nevertheless captures the broader theme. Wherever they go, something closes. Restaurants, relationships, basic self-awareness. After hours of deliberation, the grand solution is In-N-Out, eaten on the porch so Robin can reminisce about sister wives, which is a neat trick, longing for communal life while actively presiding over its collapse. The children are loaded into the jack wagon for the drive-thru. Solomon asks for corn dogs. There are none. Disappointment is absorbed as routine. The conversation drifts to the afterlife, where Janelle's status in the family's celestial kingdom/planet is reduced to paperwork. She has a dispensation, as if eternity is an HR department. The more urgent concern surfaces immediately. Without Janelle, what happens to the 401k? Kody has no answer, because grand patriarchs are rarely fluent in budgeting, only in taking. Robin's conclusion is predictably devotional. More time on her knees, deep in prayer, hoping David Yurman, now functioning as patron saint of solvency, will finally grant what prayer apparently never did: a rental, a retirement plan, and relief from the consequences of buying 2 massive houses to compensate for divine silence. The emotional Coda tries to taste the ashes of a family that has fallen apart and discovers, with mild surprise, that ruin is not as delicious as imagined. So the day ends with a lullaby to sleep and the reassurance that tomorrow might be better, an optimism framed as a really big deal. Because even despair in this household must arrive wrapped in baby talk and branded delusion. The fascination with Christine's body has somehow become a subplot, as if the most urgent mystery in this franchise is not emotional wreckage, but cup size. The question being asked, whether Christine had breast augmentation after leaving Kody, keeps resurfacing because the visual difference is noticeable enough to invite speculation, and because the show has trained its audience to treat personal reinvention like a scavenger hunt. The tone may be framed as just curiosity, but the premise is simple. She looks more well-endowed than in earlier seasons, and the timeline conveniently overlaps with her post-marriage glow-up. Of course, the explanation does not require a conspiracy board. Weight loss alone can dramatically change proportions. When the midsection reduces, the chest can appear more prominent even without surgical intervention. A wardrobe shift helps too. Different necklines, better tailoring, and the radical concept of dressing like a person who actually likes herself will do wonders. And then there is the single most underappreciated tool in reality television transformation: a properly fitted bra. The before and after effect of supportive undergarments on a changing body is so dramatic it could qualify as special effects. That said, the speculation persists for an inconvenient reason. It appears to be true. Christine reportedly acknowledged having a breast augmentation in an interview and sounded pleased about it, which is generally the appropriate tone for someone who made a choice and paid for it. There are also claims that a tummy tuck was confirmed as well, often discussed in the context of postpartum abdominal separation and significant weight loss. That procedure, however, comes with its own reality check. It is not a magic wand, and outcomes can vary. Some are warned it may not fully resolve muscle separation and can, in certain cases, leave results that feel worse than the starting point. The moral of that story is not never do it, but rather that surgery is not a personality upgrade, and it does not come with a satisfaction guarantee. What lands with far less ambiguity is the broader context. 6 pregnancies and years of breastfeeding have physical consequences, and wanting surgical help afterward is neither shocking nor morally complicated. If anything, the surprise would be someone emerging from that experience with a body untouched by time, gravity, and biology. Add the undeniable momentum of her post-Kody era, complete with the often repeated observation that losing him was like dropping 200 pounds of loser, and the results are predictable. Confidence up, styling sharper, presentation more deliberate, and the camera suddenly catching someone who is no longer trying to disappear. Still, there is a line the commentary draws that deserves to remain. The objection is not to cosmetic procedures. It is to dishonesty about them. The expectation is straightforward. Do what is wanted, but do not perform sanctimony about being natural afterward, as though surgical enhancements are a moral failing when they are simply consumer choices. In this framing, the issue is integrity, not augmentation. Then there is the inevitable secondary spectacle. Other cast members and spouses behaving as though discretion is an optional accessory. One report describes Tony making a pointed remark suggesting a particular clip was post-surgery, while McKelty attempted to shut it down, an awkward moment that reads less like comedy and more like someone announcing private medical trivia because silence felt too strenuous. The broader assessment of Tony's on-screen presence is equally unsparing. He is characterized as persistently inappropriate, with at least one viewer initially mistaking him as transgender, an aside that functions less as analysis and more as an unfiltered snapshot of how visually confusing and socially careless his presentation can appear to audiences. And because reality television never misses a chance to complicate a simple narrative, there is also the suggestion that any breast augmentation may have occurred before Christine formally left Kody, perhaps as preparation for the exit, perhaps as part of a longer private shift that the show caught late. Another claim places confirmation with Gwen via a paid platform, which, while very on-brand for this universe, adds yet another layer of truth delivered through the franchise's ever-expanding cottage industry of side channels. The final assessment is almost comically mundane. Whether the change comes from surgery, weight loss, styling, a better bra, or a combination of all four, Christine looks happier and more self-possessed than she did when she was still performing the exhausting role of tolerated wife. The body becomes the headline because it is visible, but the real transformation is the one that cannot be measured in inches. She looks like someone who stopped asking permission to take up space. Nothing accelerates solidarity quite like a shared adversary. And yet, one of the more bewildering features of this family's internal politics is how their widely understood discomfort with Robin, whose intentions were never exactly obscured by subtlety, failed to produce the most basic outcome in group dynamics: unity. The expectation would have been simple. Christine, Mary, and Janelle had every incentive to close ranks, restrict access to the so-called sisterhood, and make it clear that the newest addition would not be casually handed full relational membership. If not as a power move, then at least as an emotional one. There is always camaraderie in collective venting. Instead, the family managed the rare feat of maintaining separate resentments in parallel, as though coordinating a shared response would have been more disruptive than the disruption itself. Christine and Janelle eventually did what logic suggested from the beginning. They bonded over the obvious problem. Mary, however, remained lodged in denial until the end, clinging to the fantasy that cooperation, particularly with the favored wife, might translate into renewed value in Kody's eyes. The strategy was almost touching in its optimism, if optimism were not so consistently punished in this household. And there was a practical deterrent that kept everyone compliant. Icing Robin out would have come at a cost. In this structure, withholding acceptance from the favorite wife was functionally the same as withholding access to Kody. The wives were rationed affection so aggressively that challenging the hierarchy risked losing the little they still received. When emotional starvation is the governing condition, rebellion becomes a luxury item. Mary, notably, possessed leverage and squandered it with remarkable efficiency. She could have aligned with the women who had been enduring the same trenches from the beginning and used her position to resist Robin's permanent ascent. Instead, the divorce was effectively a gift-wrapped transfer of stability, an institutional step that ensured Robin's long-term security. It was less a sacrifice for the family than a tidy restructuring of power that benefited exactly one person. Of course, the neatness of these conclusions is complicated by one inconvenient reality. Lived experience is not edited television. The audience sees patterns with a clarity the participants rarely enjoy. Cameras, production choices, and narrative framing create a perspective that the people inside the chaos simply do not have, especially amid constant relocations, a staggering number of children, and the recurring spectacle of financial crises that look less like fate and more like habit. Robin, in day-to-day life, was likely not villainous at every moment. The environment itself provided ample cover for plausible deniability, allowing motives to be disguised as misunderstandings and manipulation to be recast as survival. Still, the central irony remains. The family had a textbook opportunity for unity through shared skepticism, and instead chose fragmentation, each wife negotiating separately with the same system, each preserving just enough access to stay invested, and each discovering, in her own time, that the arrangement was never designed to reward solidarity. Robin's fixation on Coyote Pass is frequently presented as a wistful attachment to the family dream, the sort of communal living fantasy where everyone gathers peacefully on a porch and the sun obligingly sets on cue. That story would be more convincing if it matched reality in any measurable way. The attachment is not rooted in a sincere desire to build a shared life with the other wives. It is rooted in how comfortable plural marriage was when the burdens belonged to everyone else. The arrangement functioned beautifully, as long as the other women absorbed the emotional fallout of Kody's behavior and, more importantly, helped stabilize the household financially. In that version of plural living, Robin was free to enjoy the benefits, status, security, admiration, without being meaningfully tethered to the difficult parts: compromise, accountability, and the inconvenient presence of other adults and children with needs that do not revolve around her. That is the central problem with the Coyote Pass narrative. It is a fantasy that conspicuously omits the humans who made it possible. The scenario treats the other adults as supporting characters and the children as background noise, an impressive feat considering their stories have been the most visibly painful part of the family's unraveling. Yet the performance continues on national television as if the audience is expected to suspend not only disbelief, but basic empathy. How does a person repeatedly lament the loss of that dream while the collateral damage is being described in plain language by the people who actually lived it? And more to the point, how does sympathy remain the target when the perspective itself communicates with startling clarity that other people's grief is an acceptable price for preserving a personal fairy tale? The portrayal often lands less like heartbreak and more like entitlement dressed in sentimental lighting. Coyote Pass becomes a symbol not of family unity, but of a dethroned monarch mourning a lost castle, complete with the implication that a loyal staff should have maintained it. The posture is familiar: a self-appointed victim narrating a tragedy in which everyone else is somehow responsible for the outcome, despite bearing the brunt of the consequences. When that posture is paired with the expectation of public consolation, the effect is not vulnerability. It is audacity. And while Kody occasionally appears to have stirred into partial awareness, the more baffling question is how any awakening fails to include recognition of what this insistence signals to the very people being asked to applaud it. Greed, unfortunately, is not a minor character trait here. It is the through line. The expectation is maximal gain with minimal reciprocity. All the money, all the property, all the goodwill, all the sympathy. Preferably delivered without the inconvenience of being consistently decent in return. Even performative warmth seems to come with conditions. Basic civility toward the family's original children often appears to be an optional add-on rather than a baseline requirement, which is a curious stance for someone campaigning to be seen as the injured party in a family rupture. Coyote Pass also functions neatly as a strategic prop. Publicly, it signals devotion to the communal ideal, the legal wife earnestly committed to the shared property, the shared dream, the shared future. Privately, it reads like a hedge, an asset narrative with legal implications. With Kody's name spread across parcels and the persistent likelihood that building there would never materialize, the land begins to resemble less a home site and more an inheritance plan, conveniently positioned to benefit Robin's household. Those perpetually overcooked chicken tenders offered up as the sentimental justification for what is, at its core, a consolidation of ownership. In that framing, feigned devotion to Coyote Pass serves two purposes at once. It markets loyalty while quietly protecting a claim. This would all be troubling enough as mere opportunism, but there is an additional layer. A track record of financial recklessness and ethically questionable behavior that predates the current family saga. The pattern described is not subtle. Significant credit card debt from a prior marriage, followed by allegations of falsified information used to open credit lines connected to an ex-spouse's family business, with results that were financially devastating to others. At that point, the critique stops being about tone, tears, or misunderstandings, and starts sounding uncomfortably like a portrait of someone who treats other people's financial stability as collateral. Presented together, the insistence on Coyote Pass, the demand for sympathy, the refusal to meaningfully give back, and the history of financial harm create a cohesive image. Not a misunderstood romantic, but a calculating operator. One who wants the estate, the narrative, and the crown, and who remains mystified when the audience declines to clap. Kody Brown remains perfectly consistent in the one area that truly matters. If there is an opportunity to avoid saying anything genuinely positive about the original three wives, it will be taken, enthusiastically. The only reason that instinct is currently on a leash is because negativity is not profitable at the moment. Hence, the conveniently timed apology tour, a strategic exercise in saying just enough to look rehabilitated on camera, with the obvious option to resume criticism later when it becomes useful again. Meanwhile, Robin's contribution is simply to keep talking about the OG3 at all, as though repeatedly revisiting old wounds is a form of family bonding. It is difficult to imagine a more elegant way to signal how little improvement has actually occurred. The apologies themselves are not so much affirmations as carefully packaged insults with a polite label. Janelle is told she was loved, and her willingness to receive an apology is praised primarily because it proves she is not bitter. A helpful little note revealing that anyone who does not accept the performance is, by definition, bitter and trapped in the past. Christine is offered the inspired consolation that being a bad husband apparently served a higher purpose. It helped her find a soulmate and a fairy tale, as if mistreatment becomes meaningful once the injured party escapes it. Mary, ever the afterthought, is saved for last, with the preview clip leaning hard into the declaration that their relationship is the most toxic. Even when it is framed as honesty, it is still not kindness. It is merely cruelty, delivered with a steadier voice. The larger pattern is familiar. The egomaniac's sacred right of self-exoneration. Accountability remains unnecessary when every conversation contains two other sides of a triangle ready to absorb blame. Even while apologizing to one wife, the narrative still includes critiques of the others, ensuring the speaker can remain the aggrieved protagonist no matter which relationship is being discussed. The victim posture stays intact because it is far more comfortable than admitting that multiple people did not independently do him wrong. They simply reacted to the same behavior. Of course, the entire production has the faintly desperate sheen of a storyline assembled in a conference room. The tour reads less like emotional repair and more like a logistical solution, a manufactured reason for cast members who would otherwise avoid each other to film together. Off camera, no functional adult husband schedules a formal apology circuit and certainly does not treat it like a group-friendly event that can include a wife's current spouse. The reactions, the pacing, the solemn conversations staged as organic encounters, none of it is particularly convincing, which makes overanalyzing the dialogue a charming exercise in pretending the cameras are not the real relationship here. There is also the uncomfortable financial reality hovering behind the sincerity. The notion that everyone would heal better by building stable lives away from the show is appealing, but the alternative income streams on display look more like temporary boosts than long-term foundations. Leggings and wellness powders do not fund retirement, especially once the spotlight fades and the audience moves on. Christine appears the most likely to land on her feet, helped by David's seemingly sensible influence. Janelle's farm plans may be admirable, but they also sound like a reliable path to higher overhead, because agriculture is famously inexpensive and low risk. And hovering above all of it is the whiplash of Kody's shifting tone from the wedding special to the last tell-all, and now into this new era of scripted contrition, a change that has less to do with personal growth than with production needs. The party ended a long time ago. The remaining task is simply to keep the lights on. Substitute scribe for more.